So let me go to Jeff Jordan. And Jeff is going to do some figure painting using a new technique that he's developed that he says is so easy that even I can do it. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. Let me see. Now let's see if I can launch my screen. No. Not sharing the right screen. There we are. Now all I got to do is get it in the slideshow mode and we'll be good. And there's the slide screen. Okay. Figure painting for people who can't paint figures, which at the start of this process included me. For years, I've been intimidated by the concept of painting figures. I would paint locomotives, paint freight cars, paint structures. But when it came to the little people, I was afraid that anything I would make would be a mess and would be unhappy to put it on my layout. And so I went into a process of searching for techniques to paint figures. So tonight I'm going to give you an introduction, and next week we'll start painting. So why figures? Figures adds life to the scene and scale to the scene. These are just a couple of shots on my layout, though the scenery isn't done yet. On the left there, you may have seen that structure before. That's the machinery house from my mine, and it has full interior detail. And so I decided to leave off the siding so you could see the interior, but that looked kind of funny. And so the idea was get a couple of carpenters there who are putting the siding on. And so those are Artista figures, and they're pretty decent figures, and they came painted. So they're the exception to the rule, where I could find just the figure I wanted and a decent paint job, and literally they could go onto the layout. The fellows on the right are trying to figure out how to re-rail that derailed snowplow. They are Woodland Scenics figures, and they leave a lot to be desired. The fellow on the left looks like somebody walked up behind him and yelled boo. The big white googly eyes. And if you look at him even more closely, you'll find flash, molding seams, just, they're passable, but I'd like to have better. Factory figures, that's what I'm talking about. The fellow on the left there is a Woodland Scenics engineer. I really like to have engineers in my locomotives, especially in ON30. The cabs are relatively large, and you can see that there's nobody driving. So the fellow on the left is a Woodland Scenics figure straight out of the box. I trimmed his legs off to fit him in the cab. But again, he's got the googly eyes. He's got kind of a silly looking bandana. He's got that goofy symbol on his hat. The paint at places it runs over the edges. The fellow on the right is an early effort on my part to clean up, again, a Woodland Scenics figure, especially the face, but there was better to come. The solution. We all know Ian and his amazing figures, and it's very intimidating to see these guys with plaid jackets and so forth. And I'm not going there. I need figures that aren't pre-painted and ready to go. And I picked them out. For example, a lot of good engineers and firemen out there, other railroad figures, all come unpainted. And so the question was, how am I going to paint these guys? I went down a rabbit hole. I sat on YouTube for hours watching videos on how to paint figures. And all of these guys are military modelers or people who just model figures. And they're the center of attention. They lavish hours on their figures. They make it look hard, frankly, because they start with multiple layers of paint. They build up, they paint in the shading, they provide fine detail, and it's very intimidating. And frankly, it takes some effort and some skill to do that. And then I came to the realization that I had played with painting the faces and painting in the eyes and painting in the irises and so forth, and realized, one, it was very hard to do. And second, you don't need to do it. That our figures are part of the scenery. They don't require fine detail. They need to look natural, flat. They need to blend in. So they have basic coloring, but they don't have to be finely detailed. You don't have to paint the button that holds the guy's pocket shut and so forth. So by experimentation, I devised the simplified method I'm going to show you in the next 2 weeks, which gives me, I think, very acceptable figures with, frankly, very little figure painting skill on my part. So, painting supplies. Not a lot involved here. Paint, I use the Vallejo paint, a little bit more on that in a subsequent slide. Assorted small brushes. I figured you don't need to see pictures of. I went to Michael's or Hobby Lobby and bought, they sell assortments of like 8 small brushes and a miniature set. Some of them are chisels, some of them are round, some of them are pointers. They're inexpensive. Keep them clean, throw them away and replace them when you need to. Palettes and mixing tools. This is part of the technique. You're going to need to thin your paint. I just picked up a couple of little steel tins and you'll see those in a subsequent picture in the same aisle where they sell the paintbrushes. Magnification. Maybe some of you may be blessed with stronger vision than I, but as you can see there, I use that style of binocular magnifier. You can find those on eBay from anywhere from 20 to 30 bucks. The lenses are interchangeable. It has an LED lamp just above the lens there. And in this particular version, it's rechargeable rather than battery powered. I originally had a battery powered one and I used up an awful lot of batteries. The batteries would basically go after an hour and a half of work, whereas this, you can recharge it. And various files here. I've got little the nail file type files, also small steel files, something that you can get in small gaps and nooks to clean up the figures, and the X-Acto knife with the number 11 blade, again, to clean up the figures. And that's pretty much it. You'll see I use 1 or 2 other things. I use a primer and I use a clear fixative when I'm all finished and happy. So paint, there are a lot of choices out there, but I've settled on the Vallejo line. One, they're easily accessible to me. They sell them at Hobby Lobby. They have a lot of really nice flat colors. This happens to be the colors, the basic skin colors I use. But they have all of the railroad type colors you could ever need. And I have found that though they sell their own thinner and they sell their own delay, stuff that slows the drying of the paint, I found after some experimentation that I didn't need either of those, and that I just thinned them with a little bit of deionized water with no minerals in it, and it worked very nicely. And then I find it cleans up beautifully with isopropyl alcohol. It takes all the paint out of the brush, and if you spill, it cleans it up well, but also water cleans it up. Indeed, if you overpaint a little bit, you can take it off with a little damp cloth and wipe it off. And yeah, Vallejo paints, people complain that they're expensive, but I've never used up a bottle of Vallejo paint. You use such a small amount, especially for these figures, I'll find that I use a few drops out of these bottles on each figure. And so this tiny little bottle is actually going to go a very long way. Figures. This is an important part of the process. I discovered that, and one of the things that really got me going was using figures like this from the Aspen Modeling Company. They're available online. I believe that they are 3D printed, and they are printed with extremely fine detail. You'll see this fellow, the Oil Man, in several subsequent pictures, but you can even begin to see here, notice the nice detail, not just the edge of his jacket overlapping his overalls, but you can see the seams in his overall. His face is nicely chiseled. The fabric of his clothing is nicely sculpted. And that will all be important for this technique, because my technique does take advantage of the deeper sculpting of the figure, and really flat figures. And some of the manufactured figures are more flat. It doesn't work as well, but it still works. But pick your figures. I found that Aspen is really nice. I found that the unpainted Artista figures also are a good place to start from. But you can also repaint factory painted figures like the Woodland Scenics figures. And though they're not quite as well sculpted, using a little bit of this technique, you will come up with, I think, a figure that's much more acceptable than what you get out of the box from Woodland Scenics. At least you get rid of the googly eyes. Here's some more figures. The fellow on the left is an engineer from Aspen Models. I really like this figure. I think I may get more than one of him and paint them differently so they can go in more than one locomotive. Again, notice the detail. Notice the wrinkling on his shoulder and on his pants. Notice the detail on his face. And notice that he comes without legs. If you're like me working in ON30, there is very little room in the cab. And you should see my collection of cut off legs. I have altered a lot of figures to get guys into the cab. And so the fact that this guy comes without his legs, you just take that sprue off of the bottom and work from there. I didn't even bother painting these legs, and he's now in the cab of a locomotive. I think he's a terrific figure. The fellow on the right is an Artista figure. He's actually just slightly started there. He's got not even finished the flesh coloring, but I forgot to take a picture of him before I just barely began to paint him. But again, you can see he's got some nice definition. Look at the definition around his shirt collar, the suspenders on his pants, his cap is all nice definition. He's got some decent facial features, which again, you're going to bring out in the painting process. And this fellow has had his legs cut off. And then this is the last one I'm going to do tonight on the introduction, but this is really what I'm after. And these two photographs actually teach you an awful lot about doing your model railroad figures. Let's start with the one on the right. I have done now exactly that figure, a fella standing on the roof. He's actually on the brake wheel, but that's exactly the effect I was going for. And probably if you view them from this distance, you're close. But again, you see several things. Notice the wrinkling, the highlights and dark spots on his clothing. Notice the brim of his hat and the shadow across his face underneath the brim of the hat. The engineer, you just see an arm there. So there's not too much to learn from the engineer. The fellows on the left are really instructive. I'm not too interested in the guys on the right in the suits. There are not a lot of suits on my layout, but there are a number of guys like the fellows on the left, and I really like the way they look. Notice several things. For example, the guy second from the left, notice the deep wrinkles in his pants, the bright knees and the dark wrinkles. Notice their caps and the shading. The same guy has got the pork pie style cap, and there's a dark shadow between the hat and the brim, and then there's a shadow on his face. Notice the guy on the right, again, a shadow on his hat, dark shadow on his face, wrinkles on his pants. These are all things that bring these guys to life. And unlike your boxcar model or your structure, where the room lighting will more or less give you shadows on the model, your figures don't get shadows from the room lighting. You've got to paint in the shadowing effect, the highlights and the shadows. And that's what got intimidating. Well, gee, do I have to do 4 coats of paint and paint shadows and paint highlights and so forth, like they do in the YouTube videos? And as you'll see as I go along next week, the answer is no. That the technique that I've developed, though it's not super detail and it's not museum quality and it's not Ian's figures, but it's acceptable figures. One last important lesson I want you to learn from looking at these guys. You can't see the whites of their eyes. Indeed, you really can't see their eyes at all. All you see is shadows where their eyes are. Remember that when you go to paint these guys, you don't paint white eyeballs, you don't paint irises, you don't do anything of that. You just shadow where the eye sockets are. Again, the guy up on the upper right, you can't see his eyes there at all. And these fellows, even close up, all you see is the eye sockets with a shadow. And so that's what I'm looking for when I start painting. So that's my introduction for tonight. And then next week, well, I'll actually get the paints out and you will see how I go from the bare figure into the techniques of coloring their face, their hands, their clothing, all the way to a finished model. But that's where we are for now.
Anybody have any questions for Jeff right now? Jeff, thank you so much. Looking forward to next week. This sounds like a great technique that even I can do.
That's the idea. I don't want, when you're done, you shouldn't be intimidated. You will see that there's not that much to getting these basic figures. And you'll see several of my products at the end here where I had no previous experience painting figures.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for doing this.